Welcome to Ontario Church Stories. My name is Alan Stouffer.
And I'm Claire Fuller. Thanks for being our guest presenter on this episode, Alan. I have a book here called The Light of Nature and the Law of God, Anti-Slavery in Ontario in 1833 to 1877. What was your specialty as a historian?
My area was American history, particularly 19th century history, with emphasis on American foreign relations. And within that field, I focused on Canadian-American relations.
Okay, that's why this book came up? There's something about American relations here?
Well, yes. In the 19th century, of course, the middle part of the 19th century, slavery was a major issue. And that was at the heart of the American Civil War. And the anti-slavery movement in the United States was bound to have an impact in Ontario. And I decided to take a look at what the people in Ontario did, the residents of Ontario did, to advance the anti-slavery cause.
All right. Now, your name is Stouffer, and there's a town in Ontario called Stouffville. Are you the one they named the town after?
No, they didn't name the town after me, of course, but I'm a descendant of Abraham Stouffer, who moved from Pennsylvania at the beginning of the 19th century, and the town took its name from him.
Samuel Goudie lived for a long time in Stouffville. I'm wondering, he died in 1951, and I think you were a boy then. So what was he like?
Well, he was a retiring man. That's how I recall him. I saw him around our church quite frequently. He wasn't there every Sunday, but he was there. And I remember him dressed in a black suit, and he always wore a clerical collar, and he had a head of white hair that was very prominent. And he had round glasses also.
Was he tall? Was he short?
He was average height.
Oh, average height.
Yes.
Okay. He just looks tall in pictures because his wife was very short, I guess.
Yeah, she was a short woman.
Okay. So did you know that he had been a pastor and a church leader in the denomination?
I knew that he had been a pastor, and because he wasn't at church regularly, I assumed that he was still a church leader and was out visiting other congregations. But I was a young boy at the time, probably 12 or 13, and I was not too interested and too observant about those things.
All right. Did you know that he was a conscientious objector in his lifetime?
I didn't have any particular knowledge of that, but inasmuch as he was part of our church, and there were divided notions about war in our church, it doesn't surprise me that he was a conscientious objector or that he was non-resistant. We had people in our church. I remember my Sunday school teacher, for example, was very much opposed to the idea of fighting, but there were other members of that church who were actually involved in the war.
Okay. The war that was going on while you were growing up?
Yes.
Oh, well.
What do we know about Samuel Goudie's family?
Well, Sam Goudie was the youngest of many brothers. He had a half-sister as well from his father's first marriage. He grew up on a farm near Hespeler that's part of Cambridge now. And then the family moved to a farm near Breslau, where the Waterloo Airport is now. His mother, Nancy Warner, was a Mennonite, but his father, David Goudie, was born in Scotland, so he was Scottish.
Did the family identify as Scottish and Presbyterian or as German and Mennonite?
Well, Sam Goudie's grandfather, Hugh, lived with them on the farm, but in the census he always said he was Presbyterian. But David Goudie, Sam Goudie's father, went to the Mennonite meeting houses with his family around Waterloo County. So the family could speak German, which is unusual, German and English. And the sons all married Tunker Mennonite girls pretty well. So they identified as German and Mennonite. But I think it's because David, when he came to Canada as a young immigrant teenager, worked on Mennonite farms.
Now, when did Sam Goudie's non-resistance show up? How did it express itself?
Okay, it showed up at the time of war. In fact, the Great War, the First World War. Canada was using a lot of young men in the trenches, and the country was moving toward conscription. The threat of universal conscription awakened a lot of Canadian Mennonites in Ontario and in Western Canada.
Now, you say that Prime Minister Robert Borden's government was interested and was bringing to bear universal conscription in 1917. Now, I have here a law entitled An Act to Reform the Militia in the Colonies of British North America of 48 George III, 1806, Chapter 27, which said, "Be it further enacted that the persons called Quakers, Mennonists, and Tunkers, who from certain scruples of conscience decline bearing arms, shall not be compelled to serve in the said militia." Similar language was repeated in further laws of Canada in 1906. For example, the Militia Act, Chapter 41, Section 10, said, "All male inhabitants of Canada of the age of 18 and upwards and under 60, and being British subjects, shall be liable to serve in the militia." But Section 11 continued, "The following persons only shall be exempt from liability to serve in the militia: persons who, from the doctrines of their religion, are averse to bearing arms or rendering personal military service."
Mennonites in Canada vaguely knew this, but the government introduced a new law in 1917 called the Military Service Act, which severely restricted the exemptions for young men to get out of war service. The Military Service Act granted some kind of conscientious objector status, but only to the one who, I'm quoting, "conscientiously objects to the undertaking of combatant service and is prohibited from doing so by the tenets and articles of faith in effect on the 6th day of July 1917 of any organized religious denominations existing and well organized in Canada at such date."
So no one could suddenly organize a new congregation in 1917.
Right. You had to prove that you were a member of a church, in fact, that was non-combatant so that they could claim the exemption.
It also suggests that any man between 18 and 60 could be forced to become a non-combatant member of the military, even if he was a Mennonite or a Dunker or a Quaker.
The Mennonites were trying to get answers from the government about these things. They went to Ottawa to see government officials. They were also worried about the age of baptism because young men in the Mennonite tradition often didn't get married until they were ready to be married. And the government could jump on that and say, "Aha, you're not a member of the Mennonites after all."
How did Sam Goudie get involved in this non-resistant question then?
Well, he had some personal reasons, perhaps, which are not recorded, but he had two sons who were just exactly the right age for conscription, 19 and 22 at the time. And so he and Eliza, his wife, had some very personal reasons for being concerned about the conscription of young men.
So how did Sam Goudie get involved?
A Mennonite preacher called Louis Burkholder in Markham called an informal meeting of area Mennonite pastors and leaders in November 1917. He wanted to begin a discussion about what response the Mennonites could make to the government's plans for conscription. And the immediate spark for this particular meeting was that he and a Mennonite bishop called Samuel Kaufman from Vineland had got a letter from a deputy minister of the government, a deputy minister of justice, Edmund Newcomb, which told the Mennonites everything they wanted to hear was that Mennonites were completely exempt from all forms of military service.
So where was this meeting held?
I think it was a place you know. It was at Wideman Mennonite Church.
Oh, yes. I know Weidman Mennonite Church. It's located on the west side of Highway 48, midway between the town of Markham and the town of Stouffville. And that was not too far from the farm where I grew up.
A lot of people came to this conference, people from the Old Order, people from the Mennonite Brethren in Christ, and people from the Brethren in Christ, or known as Tunkers then. And they discussed what to do. Some of Sam Goudie's friends, like a man like Milton Bricker, who was pastor of one of the nearby churches, came by. Also, Ephraim Sievenpiper, who had been a presiding elder along with Sam Goudie, he also showed up at this meeting.
What did they finally do?
They decided that they would take up the suggestion and form an association, an official meeting of Mennonite groups to talk to the government together and do it by collecting money as a gift for the government. They thought about $100,000 would be a good goal. That would be coming from their 7,000 adult members, and they worked at that. Eventually, about 8 denominations worked together on this project. They met at the home of, for the formal meeting of organizing, at the home of C.N. Good on Chapel Street here in Kitchener. They met on January 16 and voted to form. They chose a name, Non-Resistant Relief Organization, the NRRO, as they called it. Another friend of Goudie's also attended, called Silas Cressman. He became a member, one of the permanent members from the Mennonite Brethren in Christ in later years, until his death in 1935. But the first leadership were, they elected Louis Burkholder as the first chairman of the group. Sam Goudie was elected the first vice president, or vice chair rather, of the group. And a man called David Heisey from the Brethren in Christ as the first secretary-treasurer for 2 years, and then Samuel Kaufman took over from that man from then on. Many good works were also accomplished by Mennonite women's sewing circles. They made and collected a lot of clothing and worked on the logistics of sending these materials to war areas on behalf of the NRRO. And the NRRO became quite dependent on these women's groups.
What did the NRRO do with the money it raised?
They eventually did offer it to the government, and the government told them, actually, we can't receive charity offerings, so you distribute the money for us. The Non-Resistant Relief Organization sent help to quite an interesting range of causes. There was the Merchant Sailors Relief Organization for families of sailors lost from torpedoed ships, the Soldiers' Aid Commission of Ontario to care for wounded and sick returned soldiers, the Belgian Relief Fund, the French National Relief Fund called the Secours National, Armenian and Syrian Relief, and at the very end they added the Canadian Serbian Relief Committee. And you'll notice that none of these were German or Austrian organizations. After the war, the last gift was sent to China for famine relief in 1920.
How then would you say the war affected Sam Goudie?
I think the war confronted him with the need to put his faith of non-resistance into practice. He was confronted with the war sufferers, and the NRO gave him the avenue to think about that and respond. And then there's the problem of young men who were called up to war service. And so I think that he thought about it, and when the church asked him in 1920 to write an essay about non-resistance, he was ready with the thoughts and the need, and he was convinced of it and could write about it with conviction. He said that in this pamphlet called A Biblical Exegesis of the Doctrine of Non-Resistance, in which he collected 6 pages of scriptures out of the 8 pages of the pamphlet on scriptures that he thought meant that a Christian should be non-resistant. He said, I love this theme. My master, Jesus, was non-resistant in faith and practice. He thought that anybody who was a Mennonite had to support this doctrine. And in fact, he was even willing to say that it was the spirit of Jesus was non-resistant, and that everybody should be non-resistant. So he was willing to go that far to say it should be the faith of any Christian.
What did the NRRO do after the war?
They nearly disbanded. When Goudie was elected chair in 1923, the NRRO did make preparations for aiding Russian Mennonites who were planning to leave. But from 1924 on to 1934, it was rather quiet. I think Goudie was behind the annual election of 3 official representatives of the Mennonite Brethren in Christ to the NRRO, but there's no records remaining now of any activity. In 1934, Sam Goudie and his friend C.N. Goode published a pamphlet on laws affecting non-resistant religious societies. 1934 is also the year after of Hitler's election and rise to power in Germany. Japan was aggressing into China, Manchuria, as well as central China. And so it looked like war might start again. So I think members of the NRRO in Ontario then were watching the news and thinking ahead, unlike the First World War, preparing young men for what might happen to them in the coming years. In 1937, when the NRRO reorganized, the suggestion came up that they should give relief to the war sufferers of the Spanish Civil War, which they did. They also provided relief for drought conditions in northwest Canada. And they got ready so that when England finally did declare war on Germany in 1939, within weeks the NRRO was issuing appeals. Sam Kaufman was secretary at that time again, and they started collecting materials and very quickly sent material off to England for people who were fleeing bombing and so on. So they were ready that time. 1941, Louis Burkholder was no longer able to be chair of the NRRO, and Sam Goudie was elected to be the chair from that time, and he oversaw then all the activities, advising young men, collecting materials, sending war relief.
Now, Sam Goudie could not have been a young man at that point. How long was he able to continue his action with the NRRO?
Yeah, most of the NRRO members were not young men, and Sam Goudie in 1944 was 78, not a young man anymore at all, obviously, and he broke a hip that year in the fall, and he resigned. He had to resign from the Historic Peace Church committee that he was part of. He resigned from being chair, and younger people took over those positions. And he and his wife returned to Stouffville into retirement. And now you knew him in those years.
Yes, I did. I was more conscious of him, of course, in the later 40s, but I remember them as a couple. I remember Mrs. Goudie. She was a diminutive little woman, quite active. People knew her, and he was around and was quite regularly at church, and still dressed in his black suit and his clerical collar, with his glasses and his white hair. What do you think Goudie's impact was on the position of the Mennonite Brethren in Christ Church on the non-resistance question?
It's hard to say. Goudie worked by consensus and committee work, and so he wasn't often given to expressing personal opinions. In 1934, Sam Goudie and a committee published a book of questions and answers called a catechism. This may include questions on the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, possibly the Apostles' Creed. In discussing the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, Sam's final question was, does the New Testament teach non-resistance? And his answer is yes. He supplied 3 scriptures, The first being Jesus' words in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 36. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. Unfortunately, I think the catechism was not used very much. There were those in the next generation who did continue the teaching of non-resistance, such as Virgil Stauffer from Alberta, and J. Harold Shirk of Ontario, and people like Bruce Weidman, who did alternative service, along with 50 other young men in the Second World War. In 1937, when war looked like it was inevitable, the American General Conference of the Mennonite Churches, meeting in Turner, Oregon, issued a statement on peace, war, and military service that set out their plan and their expectations of possible military war happening and what their response would be to that. The Mennonite Brethren in Christ were invited to endorse this statement, but they had to make a little modification. They couldn't go along with the whole thing, but they did quote a lot of it, adding, however, that they had allowed non-combatant service for their young men. This is different from the First World War, when non-combatant service was rejected. Many of the groups that participated in the NRRO were actually split-offs from each other. So it's interesting that they joined together on the common goal of the NRRO. There was the Mennonite Brethren in Christ itself, which in several groups had split off the main old Mennonite church. And there were the Old Order that split off from the Mennonite Synod, or Mennonite Conference of Ontario. Sterling Avenue Mennonite also participated in the NRO in the 20th century, split out from First Mennonite in Kitchener. So there were a lot of groups that worked together, and yet they had divisions in earlier years. I think it's ironic that war drove these non-resistant churches together, and so that was what made them cooperate, overcoming some of the difficulties, some of the divisions of the 19th century. The NRRO was probably the first interdenominational organization that Sam Goudie's church belonged to. Sam Goudie sought personal holiness as a way of life. The NRRO gave him a way to add to that non-resistant love for people who were suffering in wars. And his church learned to give regularly for emergency needs around the world. But the NRRO was mainly a fundraising organization. Other groups sprang up between the wars to look after more positive peacemaking activities. And Sam Goudie's church joined in some of those too. But in 1962, the NRRO merged with those to form other organizations. Jesus said that there would be wars and rumors of wars until the end of time. Jesus' followers should probably learn to pay attention to the war sufferers that continue into the present day.